here today on behalf of the Union of Concerned Scientists.
In our report, we decided to focus on the deception of 6 different companies that are among the largest producers of industrial carbon emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution during the 1800s. Chevron, ConocoPhillips, BP, ExxonMobil, Shell, and not pictured here is Peabody Energy, one of the world's largest coal companies. I just want to take a brief look at some of the past examples of the deception that these companies orchestrated over the years. Here we have a leaked 1991 plan to reposition global warming as theory, not fact, via a disinformation campaign backed by coal, oil, and utility interests, including Peabody Energy, which was dubbed the Information Council on the Environment. And we'll see often corporations use fun front groups with fuzzy sounding names to hide their deception from the public. A few examples of what this group ICE planned to do. They created these advertisements that sort of evoke classic images to poke fun at the notion that somehow emitting all this carbon into the atmosphere posed a risk to the planet. You see Flat Earth, Chicken Little, among other things. These were meant to be published in publications, but they did also develop ads that were aired on the Rush Limbaugh show, who I'm sure we're all familiar with as a source of disinformation about various things in the modern age. Go forward just a few years, we have a leaked 1995 plan from the Global Climate Coalition, whose members included BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Shell, and others. These documents contained a rather frank admission by a Mobil scientist that global warming cannot be denied, even as they plotted to sow doubt about the reality and risks of climate change in the public mind. It's important to note that a lot of these things didn't just happen through front groups involving many corporations, but some companies such as ExxonMobil really engaged in very public deception directly. Here is an ad that ExxonMobil published in the New York Times back in 2000. Another key point I just want to make briefly is that the deception is ongoing. I think a lot of people tend to see this activity as something that's past, but hope that companies have found their way forward in modern day, but fortunately that's not always the case. Here we have some documents from what's known as the American Legislative Exchange Council, whose members currently include Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Peabody Energy. ALEC is well known for peddling disinformation about climate science to state legislators, many of whom have gone on to hold higher offices, such as becoming leading members of Congress. What we have here is a few leaked slides from a 2014 Heartland Institute presentation to ALEC's state legislative members. Similar remarks were made at ALEC's 2015 annual meeting, which was sponsored by ExxonMobil. At one of the few sessions that were open to reporters at that meeting, a leading ALEC member claimed that the biggest hoax of the last 100 years is global warming. This was just last summer. State legislators were then provided with so-called model policies and bills aimed at obstructing EPA limits on carbon emissions to introduce back home. Certainly, we've heard a lot tonight to be concerned about. There are signs that fossil fuel interests are starting to be held accountable. One of them right here in New York, your state attorney general has launched an investigation into ExxonMobil, and well, we'll see where that goes. One outcome is that he has subpoenaed and already received, I think, over 1,000 documents from the company. Our hope is that one day those would be made public so we can see what the company's been doing behind the scenes on climate change and their lobbying. We also saw that Shell Oil and BP did drop their membership in response to calls from the public last year. Shell in particular citing differences with ALEC's views on climate change. And an economist at BP recently admitted that climate concerns mean that some of the company's oil will ultimately have to stay on the ground, which was a pretty radical about face from what oil companies typically say. I can probably wrap up there for the sake of time. Certainly feel free to contact me if you're interested in reading our full report. There's a link to find it here. And we also have some materials out on the table, these mini folders that link to the PDF on our website.
So I guess a few questions before we let you go. What can we all do to help hold ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel interests accountable?
I think one of the big things right now is just to continue to call on attorneys generals like yours has here in New York to launch new investigations. There's been hundreds of thousands of people who've called on the Department of Justice, for example, to launch a more thorough investigation and put their resources behind getting to the bottom of this.
How have the fossil fuel interests obstructed the EPA's Clean Power Plan?
Most of you may be aware of this, but last year the EPA finalized the first ever limits on carbon pollution from power plants. And recently the Supreme Court decided to place a stay on that in response to a lawsuit filed by coal interests and a number of attorney generals from different states that are a little more sympathetic to their cause. A lot of this actually goes back to 1998 and 1999 when the EPA first suggested that they might have to step in and regulate carbon emissions because Congress wouldn't take action. What happened almost immediately after that is the American Petroleum Institute pulled together its lobbyists and said, hey, we're going to need a full-fledged legal strategy to stop this from happening. And over the years, we saw when President Bush came into office in 2000, he had initially pledged to regulate carbon, cooperating with Congress and the EPA under the Clean Air Act. He soon revoked that promise after coming under pressure from fossil fuel interests, as you can imagine. And one thing that we're getting ready to put up on our website is a document from the CEO of the P Energy thanking his administration for doing that and saying, this is exactly the sort of thing that's one of our top principles. So you see some pretty shady activity behind the scenes, but the short story would be that fossil fuel interests really ramped up efforts to dispute the idea that carbon pollution and climate change posed a risk to public health around the time that the EPA started ramping up its efforts to regulate carbon. And since then, they've been using various economic and legal arguments to try to derail what are really the first major efforts to curtail carbon emissions from their largest source in the US, power plants.
Why is ExxonMobil the focus of investigations by the Attorney Generals of New York and California, and now an initial fact-finding inquiry by the FBI?
I think part of it is because we just now have so many documents showing that Exxon really knew about the potential risks decades ago, and that really complements what we already knew about their campaign of deception that they started to implement sometime after 1988. So I would imagine that we may see other companies, such as Shell, pulled into the investigations now that similar revelations are popping up about them. And a lot of the documents that are coming to light now are from the American Petroleum Institute and really name a broad swath of representatives from different oil companies. So it's going to be interesting to see where things go from here. But for now, the most evidence is focused on ExxonMobil, so it makes sense that's where the investigations are going first.
Okay, and the last question. What are the possible outcomes of the DOJ investigation, and how is this an opportunity for us to push for a reckoning?
Well, what DOJ did in response to calls to investigate ExxonMobil was kick the issue over to the FBI for an initial fact-finding mission. So I think it's very important that the public continues to call on them to launch a more full investigation that might happen under the auspices of the FBI or the DOJ itself. And certainly at UCS, one of our hopes is that we'll be able to use subpoena power to continue gathering evidence of what the companies were doing behind the scenes. And then ultimately one day, when a judge allows it, those documents will become public, and it'll create a situation similar to what the tobacco companies faced, where they're being held publicly accountable, and it can really help to create a sea change of public opinion in our favor.
Okay. Thank you.